All right. Okay, we're official now. Sorry for the slight delay because somebody's timing's off here. I blame myself on this. So today we talk about chapter 12, the end of that, and the weekly question. Also, some encouragement perhaps to answer the weekly question using the textbook. Um, Also use specific examples. It's really, fun to say like people liked slavery because they were racist. However, more detail, more examples are good. And if you can use examples from the book, the reason that I prefer that is because we know that the book is a reliable source. Fred from an online web page about slavery may not be as reliable. Fred, we can't trust him. So, and I know you like Wikipedia and history.com, but still, Dr. Foner, he's good. So we trust him. Check out the book. Yeah, look him up online. He's legit. You'd be impressed. Okay, so our question, to what extent was Theodore Weld's argument about the sinfulness of slavery not only radical, but also necessary for the popularization of immediate abolition? Be sure to discuss the views of other abolitionists in your response. Also, I'm going to suggest some things to you, like if you can't find Theodore Weld in the book, they have this cool thing at the back of the book called the index. So you could just look him up, which I am doing right now, and it says he is on page 454, 461, and 462. So he'll show up a few times. And, if you look in those pages, it will be helpful for you. And Theodore Weld was a professor of theology and preacher. I was thinking he was at Yale Theological Seminary, but I don't, no, maybe he was at Oberlin. Crud. Let me look it up since I don't remember. I hate it when that happens. It's hard as you get older. I think you just shove something in your brain and other stuff comes out. I don't know. Weld. Oh, if you put in Weld, racing wheels come up. I had no idea. All right, Theodore Weld. I know he's from Massachusetts. I know he was married to Angelina Grimke. I know that. Okay, why was he important? He's in the Abolition Hall of Fame. I didn't even know there was one. All right. Oh, he's from Ohio originally, apparently, because he's in the Ohio history thing. All right, because I don't think your book says where he was brought up in a religious household. I knew he was from Connecticut. I wonder where he's in the, oh, see, he must have been in Oberlin. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the Ohio Hall of Fame, because Oberlin University is in Ohio. Converted by Finney, your book says that. Oh, Lane Theological Seminary, I knew that. Okay, which is in Ohio as well. All right, and it's in Southern Ohio, right across from Kentucky. All right, so if you are answering the weekly question, I know for some reason it was really important to me to figure out where he was a professor, but that matters too because he's training a lot of preachers, especially during the Second Great Awakening, religious revival. Crud, I think I took the stuff out of the oven and forgot to turn the oven off. So I'll go check that in a second. I'm sorry, stream of consciousness today. So
okay. I'm with you.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Theodore Weld, important because he's instructing people also kind of along the Mason-Dixon line, the split between the North and the South, married to Angelina Grimke, who's one of the big abolitionists. Now, if I'm answering this question, here's what I would do. I would first probably start by mentioning who Theodore Weld was and mentioning that when he's prominent, there are probably three different versions of how we should get rid of slavery: colonization, gradual emancipation, and immediate abolition or immediate emancipation. So I think I would probably have a little intro paragraph where I talked about the three different types of abolition and who Weld was. I just mentioned Theodore Weld, preacher, theologian during that time period. And his preference was immediate abolition. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about in this answer? I would then talk about why Well, maybe, let me try again. I'm really struggling today. I think I'd start off with just a general here. It's the second Great Awakening. People are thinking about reform. One of the reforms is abolition, and there are three different versions of abolition. I think that's where it starts. And then I think in the next paragraph, I talk about Theodore Weld and who he was, and why he thought immediate abolition was the most important thing. And then give some examples of other people who agreed with him and why they all came to that conclusion. The obvious part of this is if you decide that something is a sin, that it's wrong, then why would you continue it? You need to get rid of it immediately. So when people begin to accept the idea that Theodore Weld presents, and he's not the only person, you've got to mention William Lloyd Garrison in this. And why not mention Frederick Douglass? I mean, you could always mention Frederick Douglass, right? When Weld presents this idea and others agree with it and spread this idea that slavery is a sin, if you are convinced something's a sin, you have to get rid of it immediately. So the argument is going to be really between the North and the South. Is slavery truly a sin? And if you say, well, slavery is bad, but so is wage labor, murder is bad, but so is, well, murder's the worst, isn't it? Murder's bad, but so is kidnapping. So that doesn't mean we should go ahead and have both kidnapping and murder. It might mean that we need to get rid of both. So, if wage slavery, if business owners treat their employees poorly, then the solution isn't let's keep slavery. The solution is get rid of slavery and also improve how wage workers are treated. I know what I'm trying to say. I don't know if it's coming out well, but so this push for immediate abolition, because it's adopted by the biggest leaders of the abolition movement, who include Garrison and Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass never wavered on this. He was actually a slave. I mean, he understands this better than anybody. But if you are arguing that your nation's a Christian nation as well, this argument that it's a sin really is going to carry a lot of weight. So somewhere in your answer, three different types of abolition theories: Second Great Awakening, who is Weld, mention Garrison, probably Frederick Douglass as well, and then why, once you've decided that slavery is a sin, why do you have to get rid of it right away, and how that pushes the movement in a different direction. It pushes them away from, we've got time to fix this, it'll be fixed eventually, so don't worry about it, to it's a sin, God wants to get rid of it now. Okay, does any of that make sense? Little? All right, I was feeling like, yeah, maybe it didn't. All right, okay. You talk to each other. I'm gonna go see if I turn the oven off. I did. Good news. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the chapter. You ready? You're past ready. You're probably more ready than me today, huh? Sorry. All right. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be okay. I'll do my best to pay attention.
Okay, I'll do my best to teach. We'll see how it goes.
All right.
I don't know which of the two of us. Yeah, I don't know which of the two of us I'm betting on today. All right. Okay. So, Second Great Awakening, we know all about this. This is a religious movement during the time period. One of the major there's probably more than two major preachers, but we'll go with two. One is Charles Finney. And Charles Finney is more of an urban evangelist. You'll see him more in New York and Chicago. And he's going to be the guy that converts this Theodore Weld guy who shows up in your weekly question. He is a fairly emotional kind of preacher and thinks that your Christianity should have some practical applications. So if you proclaim yourself to be a Christian, you should treat people well, want to fix stuff, I don't mean like fix broken, like I had to fix my wheelbarrow because the wheel broke, that sort of thing. But if you see something wrong in society, I mean, you could still fix the wheelbarrow, but if you see something wrong in society that you want to fix it, you want to help your neighbor, you want to treat people well. If there's a system that seems to mistreat people, and you notice that because we've talked about how that is the impetus or the foundation or the motivation for all the reforms during this time period, right? Okay. So Finney's kind of your urban preacher, and then you've got your kind of traditional uh, Congregationalist guy, like leftover Puritan guy, and that is, why can I not remember? Beecher, Lyman Beecher. It's like, what is that guy's name? Or is it Henry? Yeah, Lyman's the older one, Lyman. Yeah. And then his son is Henry Ward Beecher, who's a pretty prominent preacher who will end up in a scandal. Can you imagine preachers in a scandal? And then he's got a bunch of kids. He's got like 8 or 10. But the two famous ones, the other two famous ones, sorry, are Catherine Beecher, who we'll talk about in a minute, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who you already know about because everyone does. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. You could read that for your book review if you wanted to. I wouldn't. I'm not opposed to it in any way, but it's like 400 pages long and it's a really poorly written novel. No offense, Harriet Beecher Stowe. All right, and she'll come back up later because of that novel. All right, by later I mean chapter 15, I think. All right, Second Great Awakening leads to changes. We got the major preachers, we got Theodore Weld a little bit, but the change and the urgency is in the abolition movement. So when Weld and other people start to come to the conclusion that slavery offends God, and therefore if it's a sin, it needs to be ended immediately, there's a push away from colonization or gradual emancipation. So we will discuss what colonization and gradual emancipation are. Colonization is the idea that slaves should be freed, but it would be impossible for slaves to live with white people. It also has the assumption that the United States, the land in the United States, is really intended for white people. So it's completely okay to remove Native Americans to the west of the Mississippi. Oh, that would be west of the Mississippi, or to send slaves, former slaves, to someplace in Africa. So during the Monroe presidency, a group of these colonizationists purchased some land in Africa. There was between 2 or 3 different nations that were fighting because, the land's probably cheap. And they created a country called Liberia. That's liberation, Liberia. It seems like a good idea, except, it's in the middle of a bunch of people having a civil war. And it's not it's a made up country. It's okay. It's kind of I don't know if this is a great analogy, but I'm going to make it. We're recording this, right? It's probably similar to what happens for Israel after World War II. So, after the Holocaust, England owned a bunch of land in the Middle East that was technically Palestine, or they didn't own it, but they controlled it. And so they said, you know what, let's make a homeland for the Jews right in the middle of this. And that's worked out perfectly ever since. Yeah. Liberia works out just about as well. So with a less notoriety, though. I mean, it's not in the news as much. Now, people weren't actually from Liberia. People didn't want to, most people who were slaves at this point had never lived in Africa. It was very rare to have slaves who actually lived in Africa. Typically, we're 4 or 5 generations away from Africa at this point. People didn't want to move to Liberia away from everyone they'd known and everything they'd ever known. Plus, the idea of colonization is really predicated on the idea that slave owners will come to the conclusion that slavery is a sin and that they will voluntarily free their slaves and send them to Liberia. So we're kind of 0 for 3 on that. And then probably nobody really wants to go to Liberia anyway. Now, I'm not saying Like if your choice was be a slave or go to Liberia, and those were your only two options, you might go. But the truth is that you rarely just have two options. And even if you do, maybe you can create a third, which is kind of what's going on during this time period, creating a better option. And also just the racist underpinnings of we got to send all Black people out of the United States. It's kind of racist. Yeah. So, and Frederick Douglass would argue we're more American than white people because we've, in many instances been here longer. So, plus he's Frederick Douglass. You don't want to mess with him. He's a logical fellow. Plus, he'll beat you up. So Second Great Awakening, let's see. So colonization, famous people who agreed with colonization. Don't get upset about this, okay? Are you ready to not be upset? Take a deep breath. Abraham Lincoln. Okay, now just briefly though, and this is always my argument to students who are really weird about politics. No offense if you feel this way and I just called you weird, and you get upset because politicians change their minds. Abraham Lincoln, I think, is one of the best examples of politicians who changed their minds because they thought they were wrong. I think anytime you think you're wrong, you should change your mind. So he thought colonization was a pretty good idea. And then later on, he thought about it. I mean, not much later on, he thought, no, there's some kind of racist assumptions about that. So I'm changing my mind. So good job, Abraham Lincoln. Plus, he's buddies with Frederick Douglass. I'm not suggesting Frederick Douglass was going to beat him up or anything. Frederick Douglass was not going to beat up Abraham Lincoln, but Lincoln and Douglass advised Lincoln on lots of matters, and race and slavery would be one of those. Okay. Other famous people who didn't change their minds about it: Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, and someone else whose name it. Oh, I know who it is. John Marshall. Do you know all three of those guys? John Marshall, Supreme Court Justice. Yeah. Henry Clay, Missouri Compromise. He'll also write the Compromise of 1850, which tells you he's in politics for a really long time. He also had lots of discussion about our involvement in the War of 1812. So we're talking at least 1812 to 1850. Dude's around for a while. Yeah. He does run for president 5 times. He's over. And then the other guy, Andrew Jackson, I assume you've heard of this, presidency and Indian removal and Trail of Tears. That, all right. Okay. Gradual emancipation. This is how most northern states did emancipation. There's some exceptions. I think Pennsylvania was probably different. Oh gosh, maybe it wasn't New York. There's one other, maybe Rhode Island or something. But there were a handful of states, maybe Vermont, I don't remember, one of the small states. There were a handful of states where they just said, okay, abolition, we are done with slavery. But most of the states had gradual emancipation, and there were 2 methods that usually were followed. One, they just picked a year and said in 1825, all the slaves will be free. Another method would be when all of the slaves reach age 21 or 25 or whatever age they pick, or by 1825, all the slaves will be free. So they either pick an age or a date when all the slaves are free. This is how Sojourner Truth got her freedom in New York. New York did the gradual emancipation. And a lot of times they had provisions where you could purchase your relatives out of slavery, which she did purchase some of her kids, but not all of them. Can you imagine what Thanksgiving's like when, mom paid to free some of you, but not others of you? It actually did create a few issues in the family. But I mean, she picked kids that, the younger ones, because they were farther away from being freed. But anyway, I'm sure that still wasn't much fun to explain later on. But gradual emancipation is really not done for the benefit of the slave, because I don't know too many slaves who would say, you know what, I'm not quite ready to be free. Give me 3 or 4 years. It is definitely done for the benefit of the slave owner. And so abolitionists look at this and go like, if especially once you decide that slavery is a sin, like, well, if slavery is a sin, why do we want to let it continue until somebody's 21 or until 1825. So the problem of slavery is that it harms the slave. Why would we extend slavery? Yeah. So gradual emancipation is to give the slave owner a chance to adjust to the idea, financially adjust to the idea he's going to have to pay people. Doesn't benefit the slave in any way. So most of the prominent abolitionists will favor immediate abolition for the reason that's stated here. And this really is, let's see, sorry, part of the philosophy that you see with Theodore Dwight Weld. An immediate wrong needs an immediate solution. And there's a little section in the book where it talks about moral suasion. Doesn't that sound kind of fun? Moral suasion. And it's like persuasion, of course. And that happens on page 455. And your discussion of Weld begins on 454. So 454 to 455 is probably where you want to look for that information. Really having trouble enunciating. And your whole page range was 450 to 458. So I'll try to remember to repeat that maybe once more. So all the major abolitionists of the era, including Weld, who's more of a teacher preacher, Finney also opposed slavery. So did Beecher, but the more prominent abolitionists weren't preachers. So Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth. They'll also talk about people who wrote newsletters. It's really common. That's what Garrison does. Also, Frederick Douglass writes a newsletter about slavery. It's called the North Star because that's what people looked at to guide them to freedom. Garrison's was the Liberator, but the book mentions a guy named Elijah Lovejoy who lives in Illinois and writes an abolitionist newsletter, and people in the area come to where he lives and take him out front and kill him and burn down the news office. So, and that's in Illinois, which is not a slave state. Yeah, it's kind of north. So abolition becomes a pretty sensitive topic or volatile topic. Part of the thing too, in saying that something is a sin and needs to be ended immediately, one of the discussions that they're going to have with people that are Quakers or people who are transcendentalists, who are the big transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau, both of whom opposed slavery, but thought they were much more pacifist, so they didn't think it was a good idea to fight to end slavery. They thought slavery was wrong, but that, you should end it legally, that you shouldn't have a war. And what Frederick Douglass and John Brown later on are going to convince these guys of is you can't end it peacefully if the people who own the slaves refuse to free the slaves. Because even if you passed a law during this time period that said there shouldn't be any more slaves, that doesn't mean that Southerners are going to say, you know what, I like that law, we're going to free the slaves. Remember, these are the same people that wanted to nullify a tariff, which isn't nearly as exciting. Passing a law is probably not going to end this, is the conclusion they're going to come to eventually. Not necessarily in the 1830s, not probably by the end of the 1840s, but for sure by the 1850s, it's looking ugly. Yeah, I know it's not going to end well. And of course, we had predictions about this before. All the major abolitionists favored immediate emancipation, and if slavery is a sin, you need to stop it immediately. One former president who's involved in this in kind of an unusual way is a guy named John Quincy Adams. And we like John Quincy Adams before he's president, and we like him after he's president. We don't really like him during his presidency. I don't mean we don't like him. He doesn't accomplish as much, and he's probably not as important historically in those eras. So before his presidency, he's the Monroe Doctrine Fellow. He's the Secretary of State who writes the Monroe Doctrine and helps bring an end to some conflicts overseas and makes the purchase of starts to negotiate what will eventually become the purchase of Alaska a long time later, but really improves the relationship with Russia during that time period. So he's a really good Secretary of State. And then after his presidency, he goes home and runs for Congress and gets elected. And one of his main concerns then is ending slavery. So while he's there, the Congress passes something called a gag rule. And what the gag rule did is anytime a law or a bill came up to discuss slavery, it automatically tabled that. So it meant there couldn't be any discussion, and it would have to go immediately to debate or to a vote. There couldn't be any debate. So the gag rule made it, and illegal is not the right word, but it procedurally, they couldn't discuss slavery. And it's because of this rule. So he works for about 15 years to get this thing reversed. And he also defends the freedom of slaves from a ship called the Amistad. Are you familiar? It's fine if you're not, but are you familiar with the Amistad? You know, it's a history class, so we're supposed to learn stuff. So the Amistad, I think it means friendship, something like that. It's a Spanish slave ship. And Spain had long before declared slavery illegal, and the Pope long before Spain did. So, you know, this is not supposed to be happening, but there's still Spanish and Portuguese slave traders, probably a few Dutch ones, that kind of stuff. And they typically run their slaves through Cuba. So there's a slave mutiny on this ship. And they overthrow the slave, they overthrow the crew, and they actually throw them over the ship. So they kill the crew, except for the navigator and the captain. And they tell them, however, they tell them that they need to return them to their home in Africa. And that's not exactly what happens. They instead come to the east coast of the United States, where the captain and the navigator explained that these people had committed murder and they need to be charged with murder. So the court puts all of them in prison. They try to find someone who can speak to them. They find someone on the ship docks who either was a slave or had been a slave. I think he was free at this point, but had some knowledge of their dialect, and he helped translate what had happened. Eventually, the lawyer they get to, they go to a lower court. They appeal to be heard by the Supreme Court because it's an international case, and their lawyer at the Supreme Court is John Quincy Adams, and he argues that since slavery is illegal, they were taken illegally from their country, and the guys who operated the slave ship are going to make some other argument that's clearly not convincing. And then what they're asking for is for the United States government to pay for their passage home to Sierra Leone. And that's what happens, which is pretty weird in an era where a slave like Celia can't defend herself from rape because she's not, a real person and doesn't have the rights of a person. But because these guys weren't born in the United States, they have different sorts of rights, which is kind of interesting. So this is more of an international incident than an issue of the rights of people within the United States. So their return to Sierra Leone. And if you're wondering, does this lead to other court cases where people say, well, if people in the Amistad have a right to freedom, that no, it really doesn't. Yeah. Okay. And it's a real unusual win for John Quincy Adams, but he's, a smart guy. Yeah, there we go. All right, I'm trying to think if I want to tell you anything else about slavery that I didn't tell you. Your book has lots of cool stuff in it. It shows you excerpts from books where they teach people to read with the alphabet, and the alphabet's related to slavery and why slavery is wrong. There's an American Anti-Slavery Society that has more than 100,000 members that they talk about, and the Tappan brothers, Arthur and Lewis Tappan, are the most prominent members. If you were old, which I know you're not, you might remember Tappan Appliances, but it turns into a manna, I think. But these guys were really wealthy. They were millionaire-ish kind of guys. So they fund the abolition movement, and they're going to split with the abolition movement a little bit because they're concerned that the movement lets women lead too much. Yeah. Okay. Let's see what else we want to talk about. Let's see. The women did a lot of fundraising, organizing for the abolition movement, sold things, that sort of thing. Occasionally are spokespersons. And one of the things you'll notice too is a crossover in the leadership between abolition and feminism or women's rights during this era, which is probably slightly different than women's rights in later eras. Also discussion of how people should be citizens because they're born in the United States. And of course, that will eventually become part of the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about later, of course. Let's see, what else? Abolitionists. Uncle Tom's Cabin. I feel like we've mentioned this before, but that's the Harriet Beecher Stowe book where Uncle Tom is pretty much the most Christian guy who ever lived. And they make plays out of this as well. And it makes slaves more sympathetic and seen as Christians. And their slave owners not nearly as Christian as the slaves. This is going to really fit into the argument of moral suasion, which is part of the reason it's not as, people aren't as upset about this book in the South because they see this as, somebody who really just doesn't understand the institution of slavery. And, they've never even been to the South, so it doesn't matter. Okay. You've got the discussion of Frederick Douglass and his famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, talking about how hypocritical a country is that talks about freedom and all men being created equal when they're not, and how the slave's desire for liberty probably makes him more American than not slaves. Yeah. And I think that's probably about it. Weld is going to comment quite often, and it'll mention it kind of toward the end of that section, about how there's such an emphasis on freedom in the United States in a society where we own people. So lots of discussion of how that is hypocritical and probably not a shock. Yeah. All right, let's look at the end of the chapter sort of stuff. Feminism during this time period is really about women having some political rights, like the right to vote, the right to participate in public events, public schooling, and maybe have jobs, maybe not. I mean, it's not necessarily about careers, that kind of stuff, but also the right to vote potentially. So just basic civil rights that citizens should have, the rights of citizenship. And there's a big split, honestly, between women of the era, whether this is a good thing for women or not. And there's a split, sometimes in families, like Catherine Beecher, who's sister to Harriet Beecher Stowe, although her family isn't going to strongly disagree with her. She thinks that the woman's best opportunity to make changes in society is through her family, to be an influence in the family, to be, the best original teacher for the children, to take care of the kids, to take care of the husband, that sort of stuff. So she's going to write books about how to be a good wife and mother. She's going to start female seminaries where you go to college essentially, or some sort of school, like a high school age, like late teens, early 20s school, where you learn how to be a good wife and mother. So it's basic stuff about cooking and exercise, health, nutrition. She tells you stuff like, I don't know, eat whole grain, drink some water, exercise regularly, eat a variety of foods, that kind of thing. It's pretty modern, pretty forward thinking in a lot of ways. But she also that when you're teaching your children a certain type of patience that you need to have with them and to vary the methods of teaching, that sort of stuff. I mean, stuff you wouldn't necessarily expect But she thinks women should stay out of politics in particular and voting because that will just corrupt them and ruins their opportunity to have this moral influence. What I always thought was funny about Catherine Beecher, and I read some book about her and I forget what it's called, but it's very readable if you're really interested in weird feminist stuff. I know some of you guys are going, yeah, well, and what teenager isn't interested in weird feminist stuff? But it was some biography of Catherine Beecher that I read, and it talked about how she did not want to be a wife or mother. So she created a career for herself where she went around doing public speeches and teaching at well, sort of universities, but teaching about how to be a good wife and mother, and she was neither. So I thought that was kind of fascinating. She had been engaged, and her father really pushed her to set a wedding date, which she wasn't interested in. So then he sort of tag teamed with her fiance, who was a seminary student in Scotland, I believe. They tag teamed, they set a date. He went back to Scotland to finish up his studies. And then on the way back, he died in a shipwreck. So she convinced her dad that was a sign from God that she really wasn't supposed to be married. And so he stopped bugging her about it. She was an unusually strong willed person. Yeah. Okay. I am not suggesting she killed her fiance. Not suggesting no. All right. So the classes and books, information about health, exercise. Okay, we've already talked about all this stuff. She is out of the mainstream of the women's rights movement, but not out of the mainstream for women in the era who are kind of split on the idea. Should we have more participation for women? Should we do the home and family and domestic tranquility, cult of domesticity sort of thing? All right, most of the feminist women did not agree with that and also were involved in the anti-slavery movement in ways beyond writing books, maybe giving speeches, leading seminars, that sort of stuff. So Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Seneca Falls Convention. So Mott and Stanton helped plan the Seneca Falls Convention, and the book's going to talk about that quite a bit and the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments that was created in that era. And this is really patterned from the Declaration of Independence. So they talk about how all men and women are created equal and endowed by certain rights from their creator. And among those, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So they're going to equate the same rights of citizenship for women to the rights of men. And rather than it being followed by a long list of complaints about England, which was the Declaration of Independence, it's followed by a long list of complaints about men. And I know some of you are going, well, that's sexist. Well, yeah, it's kind of the point. So the complaints against men really are about how men make sure that women don't have legal rights, they don't have education, they oppress them by denying them freedoms that other citizens should have. So they're denying them freedom simply because of their sex. And there's a big crossover as well in the male leadership and the female leadership of abolition. So you'll see like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass definitely in favor of women's rights. But the Tappan brothers, who are incredibly conservative, are not. And if you're wondering, why does that matter? Are you wondering, why does that matter? Not really. Okay. Because they had all the money. So they're funding a lot of the movement, at least the early part of the movement. And the book talks about the different branches of the movement. As time goes along, you see more of the movement through the newsletters, like the Frederick Douglass one and the William Lloyd Garrison one, North Star and the Liberator. And so that's really where you start to see more of the push. So eventually the Tappan brothers kind of come back to the fold and help out with abolition, even though they disagree about the women's rights movement. Also, I don't know, do you guys watch historical movies? Probably not. There was a movie about the Amistad. It was made by that guy that makes a lot of movies, Steven Spielberg, that guy. Yeah. And I remember watching this and thinking that is one of the least historically accurate things I've ever seen. And you know who was in it? The future governor of Texas, Matthew McConaughey. So he's thinking about running for governor. And he's one of the lawyers. He's the lawyer before they get John Quincy Adams. And in the movie, like he's way smarter, and John Quincy Adams is kind of um, like he's got Alzheimer's or something, and he really gets John Quincy Adams there just for the name, but he does all the work, which isn't even close to true. But they also have the Tappan brothers in there, and that they really want the Cinque and the other slaves to be convicted because they think it would be good for the movement. And none of that happens. It's just, better for the movie, I suppose. I don't know. But I always assume that if you watch historical movies, that you realize they're often more movie than historical. Yeah. Because the goal of a movie really is to make money and, sell tickets and be entertaining. So, sometimes history is not entertaining. Sometimes it is. All right. We still have time though, and I'm almost done. So before we go, let's see if there's anything we want to talk about that I feel like I left out. Let me peek. And you guys also feel free to talk about stuff. The book talks pretty heavily about women's suffrage, I didn't mention like the Grimke sisters and Margaret Fuller. These guys are going to write pretty prominently about women's rights. Also, they're going to equate slavery with being a female and talk about how being a woman is almost like being enslaved. And then, of course, if you're a female slave, it's even worse. The analogy between free women and enslaved, between women being enslaved kind of increases over time. And then it sort of leads to this idea of, well, if women are enslaved, then does that mean that marriage itself is slavery? And so that leads to kind of a weird and sticky discussion. And then I think we've already mentioned Angelina Grimke, one of the Grimke sisters, ends up marrying Theodore Weld, who we talked about kind of at the beginning, and with the women's rights or the abolition movement. Also, they're going to talk about how eventually there'll be a split in the abolition movement. There'll be some people who are ready to make it a political movement a little early, and so they will form something called the Liberty Party. So there'll be an anti-slavery party that forms during this era called the Liberty Party, and it's not terribly effective. Most of the people involved in the movement think it's too soon to do that, and they'll also form larger groups of anti-slavery societies that have arguments about whether having women in leadership is good, or about whether it really destroys the opportunity for men to be moral agents. So, and the book talks about all that stuff, so you get to see that kind of toward the end. And you realize too, when I'm going over the lecture, I'm not telling you everything in the book, because I don't want to ruin the fun of you reading the book, do I? Of course not. All right. Hang on a sec. All right. So gentle reminder. Let's see. Where's the share the screen thing? There it is. Okay, sorry. All right. So with your question, to what extent was Theodore Weld's argument about the sinfulness of slavery not only radical, but also necessary for popularization of immediate emancipation? Look on pages 450 to 458. And you might look a little further. I think it mentions Weld a little bit later as well. But talk about the three different types of abolition: colonization, gradual emancipation, immediate emancipation. Talk about other leaders of the movement who agreed with Weld, and about the sinfulness of slavery requiring an immediate solution, and how that eventually leads to the exclusion of the other ideas. In that discussion, I would expect to see William Lloyd Garrison mentioned, and I would expect to see Frederick Douglass mentioned as well. All right, you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns before we officially hit the road and declare class over, even though I know it's slightly early, but just a couple minutes. Don't be upset. I'll stay and answer questions. All right. Let me check the roll before we go.